Principles of the Infinite Way, 9th class, Wednesday, 3:20. Good evening, everybody. We are still in the nature of mind, and I must admit I'm inclined to stay here until we get it done. Feeling that talking about the nature of mind and going over it in detail is breaking down some of the hypnotism and breaking down the resistance, and I think that's just a very important thing to do. A couple of things came to me during the past week that I want to share first. A couple of things that haven't been covered quite sufficiently. All of the talk that we've had so far is about, we prefaced it by saying this is concerning one individual consciousness, so that we don't get into the confusion of trying to deal with the interrelationship of multiple consciousnesses. But there is one important thing that needs to be said, and that is that there is only one mind. That this tool, this mind, this tool that forms out of what consciousness creates, is single. It's not my mind and your mind and his mind and her mind. It is the one mind. And it is used by God consciousness, and it is used by individual consciousness, and it is also interpreted by individual intellects. And it is in the oneness of mind that we get the answer to questions like, why do we all see the same thing, and why and what happens if nobody's looking, what is really there, and things like that. Individual consciousness is creative, and God's consciousness is creative, and God has spiritual ideas which are in fact what constitute the universe. Now mind then forms these into material forms, material images, which are then interpreted by the various intellects. But it is all in one mind. And that I see now is why Margaret refers to mind as being space out there, because she's looking at it as the oneness. I commented a week or two ago that I think of space as being within the mind, and she thinks of mind as being space, and the two statements are really equivalent, but the focus on mind as being space, as being what's out there, is the way of looking at it that most brings to our understanding the concept that there is really only one mind. So space and mind are synonymous for all practical purposes, and that's one important thing that will come up more and more as we read these things tonight. I hope we get through this tonight, so we can go on to supply and healing. I'm going to start reading from this transcript I made of Margaret Johnson's 1994 class on mind. And once again, let's have questions, interrupt me, make sure you're hearing, tell me to read it again. This is very intense. The principle is consciousness creates, mind forms, intellect interprets. Intellect is the conditioned part of us which interprets according to our conditioning. Okay, the intellect was originally created as a faculty of discrimination, a discerning faculty which enabled man to know the difference between the Creator and the forms of the creation. That was its proper function. Intuition is the link or bridge to the soul, to the individual divine identity. As this faculty opens up, we are on the path to fourth dimensional consciousness. We cannot get there except across that bridge. The intuitive faculty must be open, and it is that we cross into fourth dimensional consciousness. As we begin to rely more and more on this soul faculty, we leave the intellect further and further behind. This ties into the the steps about how we begin to rely more and more on our intuition after we practice the 9th step or 11th step for a while. Man's so-called descent, his fall from grace, was when he transferred allegiance to the intellect and began to identify with the mental images. His consciousness moved out of the fourth dimensional consciousness and moved into its fortress position in the intellect. And he began to identify with the mental images, began to believe that material form is real and that his body is real. Except for brief flashes of intuition, which are largely ignored by the intellect as unreasonable because of no experience by which to judge them, man lives and views the illusory patterns of this world in a repetitious fashion. As man grows weary of this interminable wheel of sameness, the I begins to lift itself out of the intellect, and somewhere, very deep within, the intuition begins to function. For a moment, the intellect is still. The I ascends over the bridge of intuition and dwells briefly in the soul. This is a moment of clarity. This is where we are now, dwelling briefly in the soul. But we are not in a place where we can maintain it consciously and continuously. This is why we must remember truth every day and use the knowledge of truth to lift ourselves up to where we can have that inner door open so that the fourth dimensional consciousness can flow into the mind and impact it. You cannot always just close your eyes and reach that highest state. And that's when the letter of truth comes into play. Sometimes we have to recondition the intellect. As the journey is accomplished more frequently through meditation, the I begins to assume dominion over the senses, which are integral parts of the structural vehicle which is formed with the substance of mind for its experience on earth. The I transcends the intellect, which remembers two powers, and eventually restores it to its natural function of distinguishing between reality and illusion. The man of earth and the man of Christ are then reconciled and hereafter coexist with the Father, the All-Spirit, or universal consciousness. So this is the whole, that one very long paragraph is the whole story of the prodigal son, of the fall of man, of the illusion of separateness, and the path to return.
Did you read that second to last sentence?
Okay, the I transcends the intellect, which remembers two powers, and eventually restores it, the intellect, to its natural function of distinguishing between reality and illusion.
So it's the intellect that distinguishes between reality.
The intellect in its original purpose was designed as a discerning faculty which enabled man to know the difference between the Creator and the forms of creation. But that's not what it gets used for.
When did supposedly this fall of man take place?
Just before you were born. not relevant or why, and I've never heard anybody say when or why.
Yeah, because I would get stuck on, I always get stuck in this place. It's so hard to even explain it, but if at one point, if we had it at some time, or anybody had it, or there was one consciousness at one time, why do we have to fall from that?
It's the Leelaa, it's God's game. God is reproducing itself as individual function, as individual consciousness for its own purpose. There is no essential purpose to it. And the question, why do we have to do this, is based in the false illusion that there is a we that's doing this. The reality is that there is no we and there is no one doing this. This is all part of the illusion. The questions that we ask, the position that we take when we even think about these questions is a false position. It's a position in the illusion. It's like the hypnotized guy asking the people around him where that white dog came from. And the fact is, there is no white poodle. The world then is mind-formed, and the instruction is to be in it but not of it. Therefore, man is not to leave the mind, and man cannot leave the mind, but to understand its natural function in the scene of things. The I, dwelling in the intellect, has created images in the mind and ascribed power to them, labeling them good and evil. Remove the power, and all that's left is image, just like a picture on the wall. You remove the power from the form, and the form is nothing, which is its real nature. The mind is nothing. The pictures we look at are nothing. They are mental images in thought. Mind is pure, unconditioned. There's no good or evil in mind. It's an instrument of awareness reflecting back to us that which we are and that of which we are conscious. That which we are is not personal individual identity, it is consciousness. What is reflected back to us from the mind is, this is a typo, what is reflected back to us from the mind is I, consciousness, that of which I am aware. It's not like looking into a mirror and seeing your human sense of self. It's not like seeing your appearance reflected back to you. It's seeing that which you are conscious of as yourself. And it reflects back as appearance, as a shadow.
Lee, could you reread the part of the instrument sentence? Mind is an instrument.
Instrument sentence here.
Back. Mind is an instrument of awareness.
Was that a long time ago, or was it in this paragraph? It is an instrument of awareness reflecting back to us that which we are and that of which we are conscious. That which we are is not personal individual identity, it is consciousness. What that's saying is it's not reflecting back a body, it's reflecting back the consciousness which we are, which happens to include body. What is reflected back to us from the mind is I, consciousness, that of which I am aware. It's not like looking into a mirror and seeing your human sense of self. It's not like seeing your appearance reflected back to you. It's seeing that which you are conscious of as yourself. The point is that what you are is what you see. This is the Indian expression is Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that. And it means literally that what you are seeing is the reflection in mind of the consciousness, which is what you are. So literally what you are seeing is images created by the consciousness which you are in the mind, which is your tool. And it's all you. So the mind has no power and no intelligence and cannot sustain an image. Only the I breathes the bright breath of life into the picture and holds it in the mind. Important point.
What did you say again?
The mind has no power and no intelligence and cannot sustain an image. The mind, only the I breathes the bright breath of life into the picture and holds it in the mind. So the mind is an immediate tool, immediately reflecting now what is in the consciousness. Just as a mirror reflects what's in front of it. And when you walk away from the mirror stops reflecting immediately. This is true for the mind as well.
That's why karma makes realizing there's nothing there.
That's why karma doesn't exist. Why
when it's realized,
of course, yes.
yeah.
People who think they are sick hold that picture of illness in their mind. And there are some who just cannot let it go. It is the individual I that breathes life into the picture and holds it. And only that I can release it, or that I can let it destroy me. This is talking about cases in which healing is not successful. And we'll get into this in a couple of weeks. Healing is the art of lifting the consciousness of the individual who is maintaining the sick image of themselves to the point that they no longer have that consciousness of themselves. But if the particular consciousness is clinging to that picture of themselves, it will sustain. Only that I can release it, or that I can let it destroy me. If I give the power of good or evil, if I give it the power of good or evil, I am sustaining it by the power with which I have endowed it. The moment we withdraw power from any form, the appearance begins to dissolve. When you step in front of a mirror, there is an image. When you step away from the mirror, is blank. What is projecting and holding that image in the mirror? The question, what is projecting and holding the image in the mirror? The mind works the same way as the mirror. The minute I turn within, the image is gone. So who is holding it? Who is sustaining it?
That referring to individual I?
It's for the things like sickness and error, which are not God created, then yes, it's referring about the individual I, the individual who is, in fact, creating their body is creating has the error in that individual consciousness, and that's sustaining it. And what she's saying is, as that consciousness withdraws, if that's removed from the individual consciousness which is creating the image, the individual consciousness of which that image is a reflection, then it will immediately stop being reflected, because the mind is a now instrument. She also comments that that's what dying is about. Dying is the gradual withdrawing, the apparent physical dying of conscious people is the withdrawing of interest in the body due to lack of interest after some number of years. And this also ties in with why so many of the gurus die of strange diseases and such like. Robert is so out of touch with his body that he's essentially withdrawn all power. Robert once went to the hospital and they took his blood pressure and it was 0 over 0. Robert had forgotten to run his body for a while. And they said, your blood pressure is 0. Here's a guy walked in sitting up with no blood pressure at all. And because he knows he's supposed to walk, so he does that. And they say, your blood pressure is 0. And he said, oh. And it came back up. He withdrew his attention from it and it went to 0. Also, people like holy men, before they leave their body, often get very glassy and very transparent and very light and start showing light and illumination, and this is that same process. So it's in our consciousness, and what we see is a reflection of our consciousness.
Question. When you say only the eye breathes the image into the mind and holds it there, is that then referring to individual consciousness? Again, I just want to clarify that point.
It depends on what you're looking at. If it is, we have to distinguish between the spiritual image which God's creating and the embellishments which are man created. There are two, and this is the other point that came up, and it was going to show up in another paragraph or two. There are two kinds of images in mind. There are those images which are God-generated and nonetheless interpreted by us. And there are those images which are mind-created. And these are the images which God knows nothing of. And these are the images which can contain error, disease, what have you. And these are the images which can be healed, removed, eliminated. These are the ones that are maintained by individual consciousness, maintained essentially by intellect, by belief. These are the kinds of things that are worked on through metaphysical, mental healing and such like. Steve?
Did mind create the error, or did intellect create the error, and mind?
Mind reflected it.
Okay.
Mind is strictly this non-functional, and mind is such a habit to use mind the other way. Intellect created it.
Okay.
Consciousness created it. A consciousness which is seated in an intellect which believes in good and evil. It is therefore a consciousness which is conscious of good and evil. It is a consciousness which is conscious of sickness and health. And mind is perfectly happy to form sickness and health for consciousnesses of sickness and health. So what you are conscious of is what you see. Which is to say that seeing is believing is not true, and believing is seeing is true. And that's a reality.
So the nature of error is within the intellect.
The nature of error is the intellectual belief in more than in the power of good and evil. There is no God in the human picture. The picture has no wisdom, no substance, no intelligence, no consciousness. It's a picture. The man of earth directs his limited will, and it works temporarily on the mind as a limited form, a limited concept. But the spiritual ideas of God can never be dissolved because they are eternal and have the capacity to multiply as form. The spiritual ideas of God can never be dissolved. I just read that. It's in here twice. Because they are eternal and have the capacity to multiply as form. Anything that God has created is invincible. She's talking about mountains, tides, the law that like begets like, that the sun comes up in the east. These are images of God's real ideas, and we can't change them. Elevating our consciousness will allow us to see them more clearly. Elevating our consciousness will allow us to see the unreality of the unreal, and will allow us to see the real more clearly as it is. Man can only destroy man's own concepts. So if lack, limitation, disharmony were created by God, they could not be changed. I in my true identity and you in your true identity are eternal, infinite, spiritual individuality, the children of God, the perfect idea of the creative principle. Humanly we are multiplied form. The spiritual idea is one.
I have a question. If our individual consciousness is only can only manifest what's in it, so to speak, then how do you explain discovery?
Through intuition. When you, for a moment, get outside of the intellect and go through intuition and cross that bridge she was talking about, the fourth dimensional consciousness, then you can discover any number of the infinity of ideas which make up the omniscience of God. This is where Einstein tells us this is where the theory of relativity came from. This is where...
I still don't understand this concept. If you've got, they suddenly discovered 40,000 galaxies or something, but they're not really there. How can someone discover something that doesn't exist in their consciousness?
The image in the mind is not really there. The spiritual idea is God's creation, is the game that God's playing, is there. There is a spiritual body for each of us. It is not this material body. Finding another 40 billion galaxies is a matter of discovering more of God's infinite creation that has not previously been contacted.
What makes that any different than our bodies in terms of being real?
The materialness of it is not real. The spiritual basis of it is real, exactly as the spiritual basis of our bodies is real. Both are real. There is a spiritual body, that's a reality. There is a spiritual galaxy, that's a reality. The pictures we see of it are not real. And the pictures we see are conditioned by our state of consciousness.
Maybe it's the dream analogy.
Your head's not shaking in either direction.
I hear you, but it doesn't make sense to me. And I hear what you're saying, and I understand the logic, but it doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, well, let's keep going, and maybe it will. So whenever you are looking into your mind, i.e. out there, and complaining about all the bad pictures you are seeing, or the good pictures you are seeing, bear in mind that I am one, and mind is my instrument to reflect back to me that which I am. If I'm seeing human beings, that's who I am. If I'm seeing good and evil, that's what I am. If I'm seeing the Christ, if I'm seeing the perfect ideal, even though I have to look through the appearance, then that's what I am. And more our environment begins to change. We begin to see harmonious relationships where dissension was. Our fears about employment, income, companionship all disappear, because when you realize the Christ, you realize all, that is everything, the perfect spiritual ideal of man. And so your world begins to change, and those persons who cannot respond to that will fade out of your consciousness. She's saying that there is a spiritual ideal of man. And there are a multiplicity of these spiritual ideals of man. And each spiritual ideal of man, each individual consciousness, has a history with it contained in its intellect. And it is what we are seeing as this body, what I see as my body, is not God's spiritual ideal of man. It is God's spiritual ideal of man as reinterpreted by my cloudy consciousness, which believes in good and evil and things like that. The higher we go, the more we become aware of the one mind as the instrument of the Supreme I, and we no longer accept the superimposed suggestions of humans. We reject these suggestions and know they will not prosper as long as we are dwelling in the secret place of the Most High, as long as I recognize God as the creative power, as the only power, and I am that. Illumination is a spiritual experience of oneness with the creative force and results in a consciousness of the three omnis. We are still aware of it through the mind, however. As long as we're wearing a body, we're going to see images. But as our consciousness rises, we will see more and more God's truth rather than the adulterations of that truth as introduced through the conditioned intellect. And there's one more section here. She's asked the question, how does God is the substance of all form go with all the forms we see are nothing except reflections of the mind? And this, again, is to the same thing. Once the mind becomes permeated with the truth and the intellect is purified of false belief, then God becomes the substance and essence of all forms. And the forms can then be multiplied because that's the reality of it. The mental forms that just keep going round and round because there is no I directing them are a product of the intellect, and they do not multiply. They cannot be multiplied. This is the principle behind Jesus multiplying the loaves and fishes, and the principle behind the one man in multiplied form on earth. It is multiplied form, a spiritual idea such as multiplied form when it is spiritually realized, but mentally it cannot be multiplied. She is, and this is the area that I wasn't clear on before, but she is talking about the difference between God's ideas and God-formed images and mental images created by man, by the intellect. What the question is asking is what's the difference between the world made flesh, which is permanent, and the flesh that is here today and can be thrown into the oven tomorrow. Once the mind becomes permeated with truth and the intellect is purified, then the truth becomes the essence of the forms of mind. And that is the form that is indestructible, like mountains, oceans, planets. But the form that we see, that we live with day in and day out, like clothing, images of body, automobiles, houses, the multitudinous infinite forms that we see like these are destructible. They not only can be destroyed, they can be changed. The images are changed constantly as the intellect provides more and more complicated ways to change the forms and keep you entertained and attached. At this point, we have really hit all the topics. We have said it all now. She has more questions and answers than she does. And that's not true. She now reads certain sections. I don't think I'll read her reading Joel, but she now reads sections from the Thunder of Silence, which is Joel's best work on the mind. It's his highest work. And it really doesn't say anything different than Margaret said. I was surprised actually to find it in the Thunder of Silence, having, Margaret opened my eyes enough that when I read the Thunder of Silence, I then found that Joel had said it years before then. But I think that is as much as I'm going to read of Margaret's thing. I will make copies of this and give them to you. It would probably be a good idea to get these tapes and spend time in the tapes and reading this. I had picked out a few things. Maybe I will read a little bit. This is from Joel. Mind forms its own conditions of matter, body, and form. Mind does not create, mind forms. Creation is already complete, spiritual, eternal, and perfect. But our mind, depending on its conditioning, and by that he means the intellect conditioning, forms and interprets our human experience on this plane. If our mind is completely free of the judgment of good and evil, then spirit forms its own image and likeness through the mind as happy, harmonious, and successful living. If mind is conditioned by judgments of good and evil, mind is not a clear transparency, and in proportion to its conditioning will experiences of good and evil take place in our lives. This is the same thing that she was saying. It's the through the glass darkly type thing. If you think of a lens and you think of our conditioned belief in good and evil as clouding the lens, then we see out there images which are good and evil. But as we drop the belief in good and evil, as we drop the conditioning in good and evil, we stop putting anything on the images that are the thoughts of God, if you will, the thoughts in God's consciousness, and the form that we see then reflects unconditioned God thoughts rather than conditioned God thoughts. So we essentially are the lens, or if you think of the funnel, if you think of the end of the funnel, back to the funnel, which is God, and the spout, which is individual consciousness, then at the bottom of the spout, put a lens, which is the conditioning. And below the spout is mind. All the space, all the 3D world is mind. Now that lens is, if it's clear, if the conditioning is not there, if your intellect is not involved at all, then the pipe is open straight to God, and it's not obscured, and what you see as you look out through the lens into the mind is a more accurate reflection of God's thoughts. If, however, we have our own conditioning, we're essentially filtering God's thoughts and putting our own conditioning on them, our own beliefs in good and evil. And the other thing is that we can actually add stuff that is not coming from God. Things can be sourced by a consciousness seated in the intellect. Our consciousness, the individual consciousness, is creative as well. But the belief in good and evil is the ego, is humanhood. That whole thing is one package. I mean, that's why we talk about belief in good and evil, but we really mean belief in good and evil, belief in duality, belief in error, belief in the reality of matter, belief in atoms, belief in all of this, belief in a self, a body, an ego, I, me, separate from God. All of that is just one thing. The personal I is all one package. Robert always told us, he always told us to do self-inquiry. He says, find out who it is that's asking these questions. What he was saying is, and he's so right, that this entire structure is based on I separate from God, I an individual, I in a good and evil world, I in a material world, this whole package. It's all mental, it's all intellect, it's all nothing.
Spiritual discernment, the intellect as a clear lens.
Yes. Yeah, discernment. She uses, and I think Joel uses, most of the infinite way people use the word discernment. I would almost use realization interchangeably with discernment. Discerning is used in the sense of discerning truth, which is a realization, or discerning falsehood, and that's what was meant by the intuition being a tool for discerning the difference between God's creation and the unreality of of mind's creations. More from Joel. When we're faced with a problem at any level, we must first remember that the substance of the visible universe is unconditioned mind, which is the instrument of pure immortal being, essence, substance, and reality. And its formations are also unconditioned because they are mind itself appearing as infinite form. Mind, unconditioned and having no qualities of good or evil, is the substance of all that is visible, and all that is as unconditioned as the mind, which is its basis. In other words, there's no good and evil out there in these images. If this were not true, it would be impossible for our state of consciousness to produce changes in what we call the material universe. Those who have actually witnessed or experienced metaphysical and spiritual healing know that a practitioner may be anywhere from 1 to 25,000 miles away from the patient and nevertheless be the instrument through which a fever is reduced, a lump is removed, or wasted lungs restored, because when the practitioner has attained sufficient stillness for the mind to be a pure transparency for God, the condition of the body changes. Our consciousness of this truth is the law of harmony, and therefore if we were called upon to help someone who had a fever and were to realize that mind, unconditioned mind, is the substance of all visible form, and that this universal belief in two powers, good and evil, is not operative because it is the arm of flesh or nothingness, then the fever disappeared, we would know that our consciousness of one power, which is really a consciousness of no power, had produced the healing and was a law of harmony. The moment you think of mind in terms of your mind and my mind, separate and apart from the one unconditioned mind, you've missed the point. But once you begin to understand that there is only one mind, you will never do anything unless it is in keeping with God's law. It will never be your will or my will. It will be God's will. In the surrender of personal will, this unconditioned mind can operate in us and through us. As long as we condition mind with beliefs of good and evil, we will bring forth good and evil in proportion to our faith or belief. As man becomes convinced in his heart, so it is unto him. It is all a matter of conditioning, and you can condition yourself for good or evil, but when you leave the realm of conditioning, you are in the realm of that mind which was also in Christ Jesus. Drop the conditioning, drop the belief in good and evil. And just for kicks, this book is The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot, and I wanted just to read a couple of quotes. He's talking about some theories that are being propounded by a guy named David Bohm, who was one of the really number one creative physicists in the world, a student of Einstein, and one of the very respected theoretical physicists who has been doing his own thinking based on observable phenomena which he's been forced to attempt to explain, and the observable phenomena which has not been explainable because of inconsistencies, like particles are waves, but when you look at them, they're particles, and there's just great deals of weirdness going on down in the subatomic universe. And just a couple of quotes, he says, "In fact, Bohm believes that consciousness is a more subtle form of matter, and that the basis for any relationship between the two lies not in our own level of reality, but deep in the implicate order. Consciousness is present in various degrees of enfoldment and unfoldment in all matter." This is a physicist forced to conclude this from trying to bring consistency to what he's observing. Bohm believes that the same is true at our own level of existence. Space is not empty, it is full, a plenum as opposed to a vacuum, and the ground for the existence of everything, including ourselves. The universe is not separate from this cosmic sea of energy. It is a ripple on the surface, a comparatively small pattern of excitation in the midst of an unimaginably vast ocean. I mean, this guy is seeing God, he just doesn't know the word. There's another guy named Pribram who is a psychologist who also has brains construct objects pales beside another of Bohm's conclusions, that we even construct space and time. The implications of this view, etc., etc. And the last little... At this point we might ask it, they've been talking about experiments in which the observation seems to determine what the result of the belief of the observer seems to determine the result of the experiment. At this point we might ask, if consciousness can make such extraordinary alterations under special circumstances, what role does it play in the creation of our day-to-day reality? Opinions are extremely varied. In private conversation, Bohm admits to believing that the universe is all thought, and reality only exists in what we think. But again, he prefers not to speculate about miraculous occurrences. So this is a fun book to play with. And it's just so clear that they're seeing the same thing that the mystics have seen for centuries and centuries. And I got a letter from Robert 3 or 4 weeks ago. He says, self speaks to self, abide in yourself as self. There are not two. When you cease to identify with the body-mind, you shine in all your glory. The body is a mental image. It has no substance whatsoever. Only your belief in its reality makes it substantial, seems substantial. Stillness is your nature. Live in no mind. When your mind is still, you will see that you were never born and cannot die. That is your birthright. I like that. Your birthright is that you were never born and will never die. So, there's consistency.
There's a lot better than, hi, how are you? I'm fine.
He's not fine, he's empty. He finds it in emptiness. He's not even fine. Put that down. That would be an interesting recording. I guess that's as far as we're going to go with mind. Next week we'll do supply, which falls out directly from mind. Let's look at the recognition exercises. We were through number 5 last week. We're on 6 this week. 5 was, I recognize that the conscious resting in the presence of God lifts the hypnosis and sets me free. Any questions about that, or any comments, or do people play with them at all? It must be easy. Number 6 is, I recognize that the faculty I must use to achieve this conscious God contact is my faculty of awareness, an instrument totally separate from my mind. What that is saying is what Margaret calls the awareness faculty is what Margaret refers to as the intuitive faculty. And Margaret's comment about the intuition being the only bridge that one makes to the God consciousness, the only way we can have of accomplishing that connection is through intuition. And the 6th recognition exercise says the same thing, that the only faculty that I can use to achieve this God consciousness is awareness or intuition. We have to an instrument totally separate from my mind or totally separate from my intellect or bypassing my intellect. So, as usual, there's consistency in truth. It's just a matter of different ways of expressing it. Questions?
In Thunder of Silence, I heard this morning where he's talking about the dollar bill. What part I'm talking about?
I don't recall it.
In the chapter A Rose is a Rose, he has this little exercise where he says, take out a dollar bill and look at it. And I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it was this exercise that he leads you through to let go of labeling it good or evil, and to see that it is just material form and that it really has no presence at all. That was, I keep going to, well, is there something that I can do to consciously practice this? And this morning when I read that, I thought, oh, this is a little exercise that I can do.
Okay, good.
I don't know if that helps anybody else.
One thing that I'm consistently delighted with is seeing the same thing crop up over and over. You know, the consistency that you're just talking about. I remember reading 25 years ago, the only thing that's real is that which changes not. And that falls directly into, an illumined or an awake consciousness reflecting back, and that doesn't change the mountains, those don't change. And I just love that. It's the same.
Yeah, the answers were here tonight, by the way, for the things that you and I were talking about after Barbara's class back in late December, too, about who's doing what to whom.
Right.
I would recommend that people spend, this, just dwelling in it, we're not going to get it at a functional level. We can hear it, and we've done what I've set out to do in the class, I think, tonight. We've heard all the statements that I know about mind. They've all been said. They've all been said 5 or 10 different ways by Margaret, with different viewpoints and such like. So it's all been heard. And now what we need to do is dwell in that, for a year maybe. I don't know how long, but we need to dwell in it. And I would suggest I will make everybody copies of this transcript and also the tapes from this class and our discussion here and reading, and anybody that wants, we can get copies of Margaret's tapes. And, the answer is dwell in it now. Dwell in it. Practice it daily. Set your watch to beep every hour and remember it for 10 seconds. Just immerse yourself in it. Decondition the mind. Bring truth to the mind, to the intellect. Decondition the intellect. Bring truth to the intellect. Reverse its thinking. Consciously deprogram the intellect and work on elevating your consciousness out of the intellect. And of course practicing meditation, which is the awareness exercise, the direct contact. Let's get quiet for a few minutes and see.
Does everyone have the Thunder of Silence on tape?
Oh.
Because I just played it again yesterday up at the Motion Picture Home, and it's just unbelievable. Barbara recommended that every student have the Deep Silence of My Peace and Thunder of Silence. She says they are the Alpha and the Omega, and she said we should hear them every single day. One day, one the other. Like, we made copies, and we put Deep Silence on both sides and then thunder on both sides, and we just flipped them for 2, 3, 4 years. Every night, every morning we had one or the other going, as we awaken and go, and that really prepares that mind, and it sinks in. And that do you have that thunder silence tape?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how long since all the gangs heard it, but God, it's just it's
I think actually Diane has it.
And,
It's one of the 3 you have.
yeah, but it's just not any plainer on anything, and I really recommend everybody get their own copy because it's.
How do you get a copy of it?
That little blue catalog.
We'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Okay. And also in Diane's question, the first and second chapter of Genesis makes it very clear how it all started. In the first chapter, of course it's an analogy, but the first chapter is before the fall, and the second chapter is very plainly after the fall of mind. And it's very clear. Once you have this, you go back and you read first and second Genesis, it's very clear how and when it happened. I don't mean there was an Adam and Eve, but I mean it's really incredible to go back and read that after having this material. See it, differently.